Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's Fred Kowal, and welcome to our first ever DA webinar. And we felt it was important to do this because of the very weighty matters that will be addressed at this delegate assembly, which we have referred to as our mini constitutional convention, actually, because of the amount of constitutional amendments that are to be considered. I've been joined here by a number of folks, officers and staff, in the hopes that we can answer questions that people have. We really have intended this to serve as both an introduction to the procedure that we follow at the delegate assembly when considering constitutional amendments. That's especially for the newbies. And then second, really to do once again what we did at the fall delegate assembly out in Buffalo, and that is to go over the amendments and to discuss again what the rationale are for the amendments and to answer questions that people have. In the interest of time, because we have a great number of amendments to deal with, the way we're going to operate, which is a little bit different if you were on the webinar on the legislative agenda earlier this week. The way we did it then was people were able to submit questions in writing. What we're going to do this time instead is that we will open up your phones and we will take 3 questions, and then if your question is not asked, or if you have a question that comes to mind afterwards, you will just email that question to Jerry O'Brien Losey, our Secretary Treasurer, and then collectively we will respond to that, or whoever's the most appropriate person will respond to the question. So with that, I would like us to get started, and I'm going to introduce Jerry O'Brien Losey so that we can go over that step-by-step procedure of how we will conduct the proceedings following Robert's rules. So, Jerry.
I hate being in front of a camera. So I'm standing behind Fred. We expect this to take place on the second plenary, which starts at 1 o'clock. You'll see what you're looking at on the screen is actually a snapshot of what the agenda that'll be in the packet. So you'll see that we will be calling to order that second plenary. We'll be doing some proposed service acknowledgments, and then we'll roll right into the amendments. The amendments will be brought up individually to give time for question. Fred will be at the mic and ask for a motion to begin the discussion on 10A. It will be seconded, or it doesn't have to be seconded. Right, because it comes from the executive board, and then will be taken to open for discussion on the individual amendment. Once we hear people for and against the amendment, the discussions will be timed by individual, and then once we hear from both sides, there will be the call to question for the vote. And the amendment has to pass by 2/3.
And our intention is to, as we have in the past, to limit the debate. It is, in accordance with our accepted rules that have to be approved once the first plenary is gavelled, and that debate will be limited to 15 minutes per amendment, with a restriction to 2 minutes for question per individual, but the time for an individual amendment can be extended through a motion from the floor and then the vote of the body. And I believe it's a majority vote, but I'm not positive. We'll check with our parliamentarian. Our goal, as Jerry said, is to ensure that we do get someone to speak from both sides. In other words, if as chair I see that we have 3 or 4 or 5 individuals all speaking on one side of the debate, or especially if we hit that 15-minute mark and we have not heard anyone speak in opposition, I will open up to the last 2 minutes of that section for anyone who wishes to speak on the alternative perspective. And that is how we will proceed. There is under Robert's rules, it is acceptable to amend the proposed amendment. That's a motion from the floor. and to be taken up by the body. And then, especially for those of you who are new, a motion on an amendment takes place. That amendment must be considered before the entire amendment is voted up or down. Echoing what Jerry has just said, remembering our rules, and that is our constitutional requirement, which is standard for many organizations. 2/3 vote needed for the amendments to be approved. First, I just want Elizabeth Huff, our counsel, fulfilling her really important role, just so that I can clarify things. The amendment if you are offering an amendment to an amendment, it must be within the scope of the language being considered, okay? And that too is dependent upon a judgment from the chair, which would be me in consultation with parliamentarian and my fellow officers. But I think that by and large, as we've gone through these over the years that I've been involved in UUP, people have stuck pretty well to the topic at hand when offering an amendment. So just another thing, not to hit you with too many Robert's rules, a ruling from the chair can be overruled by the body by a 2/3 vote. Okay. With that, let's turn to the first constitutional amendment that has been proposed. What you are looking at, as Jerry said, literally is the agenda as proposed. That's got to be approved by the delegates once we meet in Albany. When we go to 10A, 10A is to basically, more than anything else, to clarify language. The language as was or has been written, and that's specifically lines 1246 to 1249, is cumbersome and in at least one interpretation amongst us is contradictory. And therefore, what we are proposing is to clean up that language such that what we are left with is what our practice has been throughout the entire known history of UUP, and that is a 2/3 vote of delegates that have gathered and are registered within the relevant delegate assembly. So at this delegate assembly, it's going to take 2/3 vote of those who are present and voting at the time of that. Specifically, it's the second plenary on Sunday afternoon. And as Jerry said, and this was the planning that went into this, we know the Sunday-Monday delegate assembly has been problematic in terms of people's schedules. What we wanted to do was put the most important a lot of important things go on at a DA, but the most important thing is consideration of these amendments. They will be considered on Sunday afternoon when we are hopeful that it'll be most convenient for all the delegates who could be present at the DA. So that's the first one. We will now open the microphones for anyone who might have a question on this first of the constitutional amendments.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Any questions on that first one? Your phones are unmuted now, so if you have a question, you can go ahead and raise it.
Yeah, if we're on the phone, Fred, if we're on the phone, we don't have the text.
You should, the webinar instructions are that it was both parts, both phone and video. So you need the computer as well.
Okay. Yeah, I have a computer here, but okay.
Fred?
Yes.
I have a question. Charlie Mackett's here.
Okay, Charlie, go ahead.
Any amendment is passed, goes through the 2/3. Does it become effective immediately?
Yes.
Unless there's an
Okay.
implementation.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Jerry. Specific in the amendments we're considering, there is one where it's relevant. There will be circumstances, actually a couple, yeah. There will be circumstances where implementation must take place in order for it to take full effect. And we'll get to that in a little while. But in this particular case, this one goes into effect immediately.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Other questions? What is it, star? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and mute the phones to go ahead and briefly summarize the second one we'll be discussing, 7-1. Okay.
To play, all participants are now in listen-only mode.
Okay. The second constitutional amendment that we'll be considering has to do with basically an outgrowth of the report that the task force that I put together years ago, having to do with the role of retirees within UUP's governance structure. And so what we have is before you is a constitutional amendment that deals with the eligibility criteria for retired membership and also service that retirees can participate in and those areas where they would not meet the criteria to participate in. And specifically, what this has to do with in terms of service, it is to restrict running for statewide office to those who are active or, as some like to say, pre-retirement individuals. And then second, there is, and I'm going to look to Jerry for this explanation, on the definition of the retirement provisions of this one. What do we have on that?
I'm sorry, I thought Elizabeth was saying something, I'm sorry.
Okay, yep.
Okay, so it's the.
Cumulative 5 years
Yeah,
of regular
the
service.
cumulative 5 years. So I'll just read for those of you who may not see not be able to see the text, the rationale. The first proposed addition of the requirement of at least 5 consecutive years of regular membership with 1 consecutive year immediately prior to retirement. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, it was what we were concerned about, and we heard from delegates and others. We didn't want what I call deathbed conversions. And that is, they're literally, someone is on their way out, then they want to take advantage of retiree benefits and eligibility, and so they join UUP right before retirement. I mean, literally like on the last day. And originally, I think we had the 5-year requirement, but as we discussed it at the fall DA, certain issues were raised about that, and we adjusted this for that 1 year prior to retirement, and that was to take account of concerns that had been raised. Yeah, it was based on input that we got from the Committee on Active Retired Members on that. So it's 2 parts. It's one, having to be a member for a certain amount of time before retiring to be able to then be a retired member of UUP. And second, retirees will no longer be eligible to run for statewide office. It, however, does not change what presently exists, and that is that the chairperson of COARM will continue to serve on the statewide executive board as a non-voting member. Okay? Jerry, was there? Yeah, go ahead.
Just to go to Charlie's point that he mentioned before, this one does have an implementation proviso we're suggesting based on the Constitution and Governance meeting that we had in October. And that's that eligibility criteria would be applied to members retiring from active service on or after July 1st, 2019. So that does have an implementation proviso.
Okay. Good. All right, I'm going to open the phones up. Same thing, right? Lynn, *71? Okay.
To play, all participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Okay. Any questions on that Second Amendment?
This is Mike Fermato from Buffalo Center.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, how you doing?
Okay.
It seems to me we are talking about 2 very separate things, and it's in one amendment, one paragraph. One being, are you eligible for retirement membership and the benefits accrued thereof? And the second being, are you eligible, and you are no longer, or if you were, retirees are not eligible to hold the state offices. Those are two separate things, very separate to me. And so that's one thing. But about the eligibility for retirement, I think it's weak. 5 years, you know, a guy's been here 30 years and he can just join the last 5. I think it should say something different. 10 years or half of the service.
Yeah, certainly. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just saying it's weak.
Yeah.
It's weak, and there is not deathbed conversions, but close enough.
Okay. Yeah, and certainly your concerns and objections can be raised during the debate. And I think that the reason we chose this time period was to take account of concerns some delegates raised and exec board members about those who would be getting employment in the state, with the state, and join us within, the final years of their career. And would that create a situation where they would, despite the fact that they might be loyal members for a certain number of years, they would not be able to ever be a retired member and take advantage of those benefits. I think that was the rationale, and the 5 years thing was a compromise. And with the understanding that we certainly understand that there are those who think that there should be a longer commitment, but at the same time there are those who felt that within 1 year was sufficient. So it was an attempt at finding a compromise. But I certainly understand your concerns about that time period. As to why the two are together, I'm going to turn to Elizabeth to maybe offer that. Go ahead.
Yeah, as we were preparing these amendments, the amendments amend a single section of the Constitution. And in consultation with the parliamentarian, you can't propose an amendment to a single section of the Constitution twice. So all of the proposed changes to the single section have to be included in the single amendment. Whether or not the delegates might choose to amend it during the course of the debate in order to delete one section or not the other is theoretically possible, but our instructions from the parliamentarian was, because it's a single section, you have to propose all of it as a single proposed amendment.
Yeah, I had a question to Charles Simpson Plattsburgh.
Yeah.
How are we protecting our contingents who may have, irregular employment with a 5-year max? They may have a semester, 2 semesters, 3 semesters in between the times that they're teaching. And
The 5 years is cumulative, not consecutive.
Yeah.
And people can carry membership even when they're not, if they're
Teaching
having
in
a
a
semester
semester,
off, they
yeah.
can still continue their membership. There's a mechanism
Okay.
for that.
okay.
Yep. Good. Thanks for asking that, though. We wanted to make sure we did take into account concerns about contingents and adjuncts specifically.
Hello,
Yes.
Carol.
Yeah.
I have a question about the 5-year requirement for benefits, and that would be for related to the people that are late hires. That it might dissuade them from joining at all if they. And I thought that there might be some kind of a caveat in there that would say, unless newly, I don't know, something that would not dissuade them from joining right from the get-go if they were new hires late in their career.
Well, there would be a appeals process for the the benefits themselves. So if that's what they're looking for, there would be a appeals process just like there is now for that. So they could write their justification. Again, should this pass, that would need to go to the trustees of the benefit trust fund to be able to come up with that process. But we've just expanded on the appeals process that already exists. If somebody's hospitalized now and doesn't, for 6 months in a coma or a year in a coma and comes out, there's an appeals process for them to receive the benefits.
But if the Constitution says you must have 5 years of service, and you're
That's a
They're
process
separate, yeah.
question. They're separate. That's a process, Carol, that's a process question. So process is separate from that piece.
Yeah, and with regard to benefits, an appeal regarding benefits is done, as Jerry was saying, separate from whatever the membership requirements might be. And because we get a lot of appeals that we have to deal with as trustees, and we hold those separate from membership status, which we have to, as long as the benefits are at present time. Obviously, a vast majority of them have to do with benefits that are funded by state dollars. So that includes members and non-members within our bargaining unit. But that's a big question, Carol. That's something that we went over a lot. And the answer that we found is no, we can treat benefits an appeals process separate from what the membership might be. And in our discussions with COARM, that was how that issue, which others have raised, was satisfied.
So if I expect to start employment and I only expect to work for 4 years, when I retire, I will not be able to get UUP benefits. Is that?
Yes, but go ahead.
Look, there are two different issues. What the Constitution defines is eligibility for retiree membership. Independent of the question of retiree membership is how the Board of Trustees of the Benefit Trust Fund will define who is eligible to continue dental or vision after retiring from state service. The two may not necessarily be identical. This defines what would give people eligibility for retiree membership in the organization.
Membership, okay, not necessarily benefits.
Right, exactly.
Just caught up. Thank you.
It's okay. All right. Now, that was 3 questions. I've been reminded by someone here. I won't identify. So if there are individuals have further questions on this, just send an email to Jerry O'Brien Losi on this one, and we'll move on to 10C. This is a cleanup article. This is intended to basically bring our language up to date so that it reflects what is in the New York State human rights law, prohibiting discrimination by labor organization. And if you see the language in front of you, you can see where we have made some changes in terms of gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, and then beyond that as well, areas which we did not include, like military status, predisposing genetic characteristics, etc. So this is what I refer to as a cleanup amendment. So any questions on that one?
All participants are now in listen-only mode.
Whoops.
To
Okay.
play, all participants
Yeah, I
are
think so.
now
Yeah.
in interactive talk mode.
Okay, let me repeat because I think I just muted myself. It's been a long week. So here we go. I did it so well last time, I'll try not to screw it up. What Amendment 10C, or Section 10C in the agenda, refers to is a cleanup of our language. Brings us into compliance with New York's, not compliance, but to match what is required under New York State human rights law regarding how labor organizations deal with differences and diversity within our membership. And so, for instance, instead of just gender, we now will have gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, familial status, predisposing genetic characteristics and so forth. You can see the changes there. We drop handicap, replace with disability. So this is a cleanup amendment, okay? And updates our Constitution as it should be. So, any questions on that one? I think they must be unmuted because I can hear stuff. Yeah.
And for those of you who are new, this is also, this amendment came to us from Binghamton University chapter.
Okay. Yep. All right. Let's move on.
All participants are now in listen-only mode.
Okay. I got it right this time. Okay. Now, a big one, which is item 10D, the constitutional amendment to eliminate the Winter Delegate Assembly. This is, and the language is fairly clear, and that is, and simple. Just changes 3 to 2 and stipulates that it be a fall and spring delegate assembly. The rationale, there are various rationales for this. One is that we have seen attendance at the Winter Delegate Assembly become more and more problematic, as in dropping. We have found that there are endless challenges with scheduling the Winter Delegate Assembly because of the beginnings of semester, classes beginning and delegations being decimated by the requirement to have people around at the start of classes. We have found that with the compressed legislative calendar and our own scheduling, that scheduling the winter DA so that we could do advocacy to coincide with what was happening in Albany, unfortunately, having to have the DA in January, and that's because of the gap between the winter and spring DAs, often has meant that, as it is this year, we have this delegate assembly right after I will be testifying, literally within days, which means the session has just started. We are going to have Advocacy Day, but it's a week later. And so there isn't anything to be gained by having delegates come in and then immediately do advocating. We're also finding that in-district lobbying is what is way more effective. And then there's the obvious cost involved in the Winter Delegate Assembly. The cost is high. We are facing, in the post-Janus environment, financial challenges, and the requirement that more and more of our resources go to the chapters. And in order for us to sustain the release time, the organizing staff, and the support for the organizing activities, which include having officers out on the road almost constantly, whether it be in regional meetings or at campus meetings, it simply becomes both financially and logistically more and more difficult to have the winter DA. It also will help us in scheduling, especially the spring delegate assembly. We've had problems with the spring DA because it has run into end of semester activities. Again, there's a requirement that there be this time period between DAs, and in doing so, we run into that problem. Without a winter DA, we can hold the spring DA in April. We have less of a conflict with final exams, with Mother's Day, with commencement activities. And for that matter, in the fall, we can move the fall DA later into the fall and take advantage of lower costs for places where we would be gathering, which of course translates to opening the field in terms of where we can have DAs, where now there are certain areas of the state that are simply unaffordable for us. They may become affordable as we move into late October or November for a fall delegate assembly. I also happen to think that it's good to be able to correspond to the semester structure. And so for all of these reasons, I feel very strongly that it's time for us to take this important step to meet in the fall and in the spring, to meet between those times, to utilize resources, for instance, to have more frequent chapter presidents meetings without having to just have them at delegate assemblies. But then also what we find that works very well, and that is to have regional meetings where we can bring in more delegates and rank and file in sections of the state while not just conducting the business of the union, but listening very closely to the concerns that our members have. I think overriding everything, along with the cost, is what I believe to be the need for us to understand that so much of our success so far in keeping our union strong in terms of organizing and membership is because we have put so many resources into the chapters and so much time and energy there. And that's what will benefit the most from a change to our Constitution such that this Winter Delegate Assembly would mark the point where we decide this is it. It would be our last Winter Delegate Assembly. So I think I hit all of the major arguments, and so I'll open it up to any questions that people may have on this particular constitutional amendment. Any questions on that's 10D? Okay, hearing none. We'll move to 10E.
Only mode.
So this is a cleanup amendment. If the item in 10D passes, then we need to change the next one. Article 9, having to do with referenda, which I don't know if in the history of UUP there has ever been one, but previously, as you see in the language, if we had 3 DAs, the action by the Delegate Assembly needed to take place in the third regular meeting. It's just moved to the second. That reflects the fact that there would be 2 as opposed to 3. So this is just a simple cleanup amendment. Okay. Anticipating no questions on this one, I'll move to 10F. This is also a cleanup election. So what I'll do is open up the microphones for you, the phones. So if you have questions on 10E and 10F. 10F was something that really should have been adjusted when we went to 3-year terms. It wasn't done. We are doing that now. As you know, the way our elections take place is this spring Delegate Assembly, there will be no statewide elections. But the language didn't reflect that. So now it does. The offices of President, Secretary, Treasurer, and MDO shall be held in the same year. Elections of Vice Presidents shall be held in subsequent years. So the next time we have an election, which will be in the spring of 2020, the Office of President, Secretary, Treasurer, and MDO will be up. And then in 2021, the Vice Presidents will be up. So I'll open up the, but also it includes, is that including Article 8? Nomination and, it's the same thing. All right, I got it now. Yeah, it's the same fix, that's it. So I'm going to open up for any questions on those last 2 cleanup amendments.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
And I should say, we've spent a lot of time with our parliamentarian, and Jerry and Elizabeth have done an incredible amount of work pouring through our Constitution and finding areas where we needed to update the document, clean it up. Literally, the alternative was to rewrite the whole thing. But this is the approach we have chosen, and hence all the amendments. So are there any questions on 10E, 10F, which includes 2 amendments in 10F, 2 separate articles, but both having to do with updating the Constitution to reflect what is now going on? Okay, hearing none, let's go to 10G.
In listen-only mode.
This is an attempt to address an issue that has been of grave concern to me really since a Delegate Assembly, I think it was the last election cycle, where I was aware of an individual who wanted to run for the statewide executive board, is committed to it. She's been very active at her chapter, and however, her husband, I believe was the case, got very ill, and she couldn't attend the DA and thus could not run for the exec board. I think it's necessary for us to take account of the eventuality that we could face a situation where an individual would not be present. So what we've done here is to remove the requirement that a delegate running for statewide officer, which includes exec board, does not need to be present. There are requirements for the submission of a nomination form, and so all of that will have to take place. But in terms of actually being present in the room when the vote takes place, that would be eliminated. And we, ironically enough, we're just talking about it over lunch that several of the officers are facing family challenges with elderly relatives or very ill relatives that, if circumstances roll out a certain way, will create for some of us potentially a very difficult choice come this delegate assembly. And this is the type of thing that could happen at a spring delegate assembly. And, you know, we also have had the case in not too long ago where one of our statewide officers was extremely ill and may not have been, might have needed to be hospitalized. And what would have been the case if she couldn't be on the floor to be elected? So this is it's a big step. It's a change in our tradition. And we know that there are those who are concerned about, a rogue candidate coming in and being elected and never taking part in a delegate assembly. I guess I expect that delegates would choose wisely and say, we're going to elect those individuals we know who have made themselves known to the delegates and so forth. So that's the sum and substance of the rationale. I'll open up the phones if anyone has a questions on that.
In interactive talk mode.
Any questions on that one?
Mike Amato in Buffalo.
Hey, Mike.
How you doing?
Okay.
I understand, and it's a humane thing. I would prefer some language that would indicate that that there's a possibility to make exceptions in cases of dire emergencies, rather than change the general concept.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, and again, Mike, certainly you can make an amendment from the floor on this to reflect your concerns. And the thing to keep in mind is who ultimately would have would make the judgment as to the issue would be, Mike, is who would make the ultimate determination as to what constitutes a dire emergency. We did toss around the idea of putting language in that specified all different circumstances, and found that it was getting cumbersome. And so we went back and forth on this, and this is where we ended up. But certainly amending from the floor, that's in order. So if you'd like to do that, you certainly can, and that'll be part of the debate.
Charlie McAteer, I have a question and a comment.
Okay, go ahead, Charlie.
On this, we would still go with the standing rules where any nomination for officer statewide or for executive board statewide would have to have some person speak for them, not themselves. So in a sense, that person, if we continue those rules, would mean they would be able to explain to all the delegates why a person may or may not be there today because of, and then the delegates who would be voting would then assess whether they feel that is appropriate and would vote accordingly. Is that the assumption?
That is, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Other questions on this one? Okay. Now we move
All
to,
participants are now in listen-only mode.
where are we now? 10H. Okay, thanks. This is it's a big issue that we have wrestled with in developing, I guess, a process to deal with the post-Janus environment. But in actuality, this predates Janus. Let me put it this way. There have been, without going into too much detail, there have been circumstances that I'm aware of that predated my election as president, and circumstances since I became president, where there have been serious concerns raised about the operation of chapters and the behavior of chapter leaders. And it has always been, a concern of mine once I started to encounter these situations that UUP as an organization, as a legal entity, has very little power to get under control situations that could develop that could threaten the organization, both financially and legally. And so what we are attempting to do here is bring us in line with what other public unions that we're aware of, and that's really what we were looking at, public unions in New York State, what they have in place so that the elected statewide organization, namely the executive board, can be called upon to examine the circumstances where there could be problems, ethical misconduct, and so forth that may be taking place at a chapter where the board, with in all likelihood, a select subcommittee of the board examines the issues, reports to the board, and then to act on behalf of the delegate assembly should a chapter officer need to be removed in the most extreme case. But we have literally, well, we have in place the means by which statewide officers can be removed. There are recall provisions, and that's good. There should be checks on the power of the statewide officers. But what we don't have is the means by which there is a way of examining, determining what the circumstances are at a chapter if there are problems, and then dealing with them. We've had these circumstances where literally my predecessor, Phil Smith, and I have had to go to AFT, NYSET Legal, to figure out how to proceed and to determine what kind of exposure we had legally in certain circumstances as an organization. And literally, we would have no means to get the situation under control as our Constitution is presently written. I realize that there may be concerns raised about the power of the statewide executive board to be heavy-handed in dealing with chapter leadership. I think what people need to realize is that legally, United University Professions is one local in the American Federation of Teachers, Local 2190. And we have a president and elected officers of that local. We have chapters, which were created as a means of organizing ourselves. But legally, chapters do not have legal standing, and yet they exercise a great deal of financial power and have a lot of decisions to make. And luckily, we have had so far, we have excellent treasurers, we have excellent chapter presidents, we have an outstanding finance department here that keeps a close eye on everything that's happening. Our procedures are good, and that's why the auditors come back with glowing reports all the time. But given the environment we are now operating in, where every flaw, mistake, whatever, can be blown out of proportion by our enemies to undermine our organization and our membership and our strength, we need to have something in place where we can protect ourselves. This is one of the amendments where there will be implementation provisions, and all of those provisions in terms of how it will be implemented, that will be voted on by a future delegate assembly. So, this is only to create the means constitutionally for us as delegates to create a procedure. So this is just the starting point. This does not create the process for, and I'm going to use extreme case, to remove a chapter president. That would be done through policy established by a delegate assembly. So all of the delegates first have the power to amend the Constitution, to create this power for themselves, and then the delegate assembly would put in place a policy that then would be carried out through the means, and that's what constitutionally is the role of the exec board, to take up issues and make decisions in the absence of a delegate assembly, which meets now 3 times a year. Our intentions are that the delegates will be meeting twice a year. So hopefully I have explained that well. It's complex. It's not easy to discuss, but I believe it's a necessary step that should be taken to protect ourselves, to create a procedure. Once you have a constitutional provision and you have a procedure established by the delegates, it is my firm hope that in fact a regular procedure, a regular process, first established through a constitutional means and then by delegates, actually will protect not just the organization, but chapters and chapter presidents. Because right now, we don't have a process. So there aren't those kinds of protections. And how we go about circumstances that require steps taken by the president or by the exec board or whomever creates an ad hoc system that is dangerous and I would argue unfair. So with that, I want to open it up to any questions that people might have.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Hi, Charles Simpson, Plattsburgh.
Yeah.
I would suggest a couple of words be added where it says investigate and hear complaints. It should be complaints from members. And then when it says alleged ethical misconduct, it should say ethical or fiscal, because they may not exactly correspond. And we don't want just anybody to make complaints. I think they have to be members of the union.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, as opposed to non-members. That's an interesting point. We hadn't thought of that. This was originally dreamed up prior to Janice. Elizabeth, you were going to comment on it? Yeah.
In terms of, at this point, because there are constitutional requirements on the publication of constitutional amendments out to the membership before the delegate assembly takes them up, we can't change any language to any of these constitutional amendments now. If delegates are interested in proposing language changes, that will need to be done through a proposed amendment on the floor at the DA. I would also just note, with regard to the implementation proviso on the development of a policy and hearing procedure, ethics policies of other unions do define what an ethical violation is to include fiscal malfeasance, because it undermines the integrity of the organization. So part of the question about what the definition of a violation is could be in a subsequent DA policy.
Yeah. So Charles, I would say propose it on the floor. I think that's a worthwhile discussion to have. I mean, especially the first item about members.
Numbers and stuff, so if
Wait, I'm getting some feedback here. So if you've got another conversation going on, if you can mute your own phone, that would be good.
that if I need to get in touch with them, that, you know.
Are there other questions on this one?
Mike from Buffalo.
Yep. It's a Mike and Charlie show.
Drop off clothes for you.
Go ahead, Mike.
I understand your intention and also the urgency that you may feel, but I feel as though the cart's before the horse. I think it's more proper to enjoin a committee to create an ethics policy and
40 years
define
later,
it,
we'll get something.
and then present that
Yeah.
in a whole, as a whole body of information, and then amend the Constitution.
Okay. Well, this was, these amendments were worked on by the Constitution and Governance Committee. So there was committee input from the committee that works on the constitutional issues. Though I certainly understand your point, which is, for there to be a committee studying I gather the scope of the issue and then to make recommendations. The only disagreement I would have, Mike, is I don't think this is putting the cart before the horse. I think that we're with the horse, so to speak, is the establishment of the constitutional power. We could still then say, okay, that in order to do the process right, the Constitution and Governance Committee will study how best to establish the actual procedure to incorporate, for instance, Charles' concerns about making sure there is a mention and a delineation of fiscal actions or financial actions. And that may take some time. And I think that's where committee work and the development of the implementation and the creation of the procedure would come into play. But certainly, as with all the other constitutional amendments, if you feel strongly that this should not be acted on, and in essence, by voting it down, goes back to the committee for more work, then obviously a no vote on the constitutional amendment would do that. So that's how I would respond, Mike. That there will be committee work on this as we get into the creation of the policy to carry it out, to create the procedure. I think I think we had two on this one. Are there any other questions on it? Hearing none. Okay, we'll move on to
All participants are now in listen-only mode.
This is a name change of committees that came to us from the Affirmative Action Committee, and also to change Article 10. That's the name change. And also the structure of the chapters such that, again, bringing the language up to date. Instead of a designee for affirmative action, a designee for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the committee's name would change to the committee, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And this comes to us from the committee because these are the names, the titles attached to individuals at the campus level in this area of work. So it brings UUP into a parallel situation with what's happening at the campuses in these titles. So are there any questions
All
on
participants are now in
10I,
mode.
which is simply a name change for the committee and at the chapter level? Okay. 10J.
Participants are now in listen-only mode.
This is, and I always get this one confused with the next one. Jerry, why don't you take this one?
So this is when there are no nominations for a chapter position, where write-in candidates must receive at least 5 votes to take place. So again, this one is, let me read from the rationale, just so everybody knows. The change would ensure that in the absence of a nominated candidate, write-in candidates will need a minimum of level of support from members of their chapter to take chapter office. In addition, it would reduce the significant commitment of time and financial expense currently associated with contacting individuals who receive less than 5 votes to determine their willingness to serve, and with conducting runoff elections among write-in candidates who have little support at the chapter level. And this also has an implementation proviso, everything regarding elections. So the provision would first be implemented in the 2021 election cycle.
Okay.
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Questions on 10J. It's the 5 write-in vote rule. Again, we're trying to, especially now again post Janus, to create a culture of organizing and activism. And the idea is that if you are interested in becoming involved or continuing to be involved in UUP's organization, its structure, its governance, there is the requirement that you do some reach out to your colleagues. That's, I would think, a given. And this is the idea that, you, as Jerry likes to say, can find 4 friends and 4 supporters for your candidacy. And it restricts, again, as you said, the costs that we face and the time that is committed to doing runoffs and so forth, and tracking people down to find out, those who got 1 write-in as to whether or not they're really interested in serving. Are there any questions on that one?
Yes, I have one question. Please clarify, I can't, is this all, any write-in has to have at least 5 votes before
This
it's
is-
considered,
This is the nomination
in the
process.
count?
In the absence of a nomination.
So no one's been nominated. We've got a blank slate for an office.
Slate.
Yeah.
And that's the only time that this, the 5 vote minimum is required, is that correct?
For this amendment.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Other questions? Okay. We move to the next one, 10K.
In listen-only mode.
And this gets into the actual votes. Last was in those cases where no one is nominated. Here, in order to be elected as a delegate and be ranked as a delegate or as an alternate, you must receive a minimum of 5 votes. Again, it's the idea that there must be some minimal level of support from your chapter in order to be elected delegate. In that we are working strenuously to change the culture of UUP so that delegates more and more see their role, our role, we're all, those of us who are statewide officers or delegates, our role to be in working with our membership, and that organizing and representing UUP to the membership at the chapter is the prime role for a delegate, and secondarily to attend delegate assemblies. Therefore, the need to reach out at a minimal level, and we thought 5 votes is, again, the idea that assuming an individual will vote for themselves, they have at least reached out to 4 other members and talked to them about UUP. obviously, if you're asking for somebody's vote to be a delegate, you have to do a little bit of a conversation about what the union is. And so it is an attempt to move us more and more in the direction of having one-on-one conversations with our fellow members to ensure that the membership stays strong. And also, we get back to the issue of having a situation where lots of individuals get one vote, and questions about the cost and so forth. But also, there are issues. One could raise the philosophical issue as to every delegate having one vote at a delegate assembly, whether that delegate received 500 votes or one vote. And some would argue that that is a violation of the one vote, one person principle. But anyway, that is 10K. Any questions on that one?
Participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Hearing none, we'll go to 10L.
To play, all participants are now in listen-only mode.
10L is lots and lots of pages of red.
10L is moving the election process out of the Constitution and procedure, into the procedure manual.
This makes absolute sense because we have really wrestled with the fact that any changes in chapter election guidelines required a constitutional amendment. And obviously, it takes a 2/3 vote. It's very difficult. And so much of our Constitution was cluttered up with guidelines for chapter elections. And so the idea here is let's move it to policy where a DA will continue to act on this. But it brings us into more of a parallel with other public unions. It allows for, I would argue, much more nimble procedure, so that as we have to change election procedures at the chapter level, as we did the last time around with the utilization of a company that utilized electronic vote counting. There are a lot of things that we would like to do, but in order to do them now, we would have to have a constitutional amendment. By putting things into DA policy, makes it neater, easier, and actually, this is something that our parliamentarian has talked about for a long time. That what we have is election procedure that really doesn't belong in a constitution. It's process, and a constitution should be much more about the big rules of the organization, and that procedure needs to be in a policy manual. So that's in some substance what we're talking about here. Any questions on this one?
All participants are now in interactive talk mode.
Any questions on 10L? I've just been informed I misspoke. It will be executive board policy, not delegate assembly policy. Right.
Well, how far in advance can the processes be changed?
Well, at present, pending the establishment of policies by the exec board, nothing will change. This is one of those amendments that literally will be held in abeyance until the board acts.
And nothing can be changed in the election process because we have begun this election process.
Yeah.
So
what I mean is, we all are, this may just be what we're used to, but we're used to getting nominations like sometime in January, nomination forms. We're used to certain things happening according to a certain calendar. How far in advance do those processes, does the
Well,
How close to the actual election can the processes be changed is what I want to know.
oh, right, yeah.
If you move it out of the Constitution, then there's there's a lot of calendar things that have to happen
No,
to change
absolutely.
the Constitution.
Yep,
So if you move it out of the Constitution, then it becomes, yes, definitely a much more pliable set of process. And so I want to understand, like, how close to an election can the process be changed? And
Yeah.
and please forgive the word just, but it's the executive board only at the statewide level that dictates when the process can be changed for the chapters. Is that
yeah.
right?
Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth, yeah.
Carol, what the amendment would do would actually require that the executive board adopt any changes and that it be published to the membership so that it mirrors the current language that's already in place regarding procedures for co-arm elections and for affiliate assembly elections. In order to assure that those elections are handled in an appropriate and regular manner, that publication out to the membership would have to occur, obviously before any part of an election process started. Now, obviously, a precise timeline could arguably be put in place.
Yep.
Where the DA could say, and any procedures that the executive board adopts would have to be adopted within a time frame. But right now, because of the requirement that there be publication to the membership, I think that in and of itself is going to assure that it's going to have to happen prior, well prior to any actual election process. And at this point, the first point that there could be any change at this point is going to be with the 2021 elections, because the current election process is already
It's underway, yeah.
underway.
And I can tell you, my intention is to bring this work to the board as soon as possible after the delegates vote on this. Should this be approved, we will get right to work so that, and this Constitution and Governance Committee prior to the board will be working on this. And so, yeah, it's an excellent point, Carol. We have got to, and I'm not sure whether the committee would recommend going in that route, but I think it would be definitely worthwhile to consider having a procedure that is locked in terms of a time period in advance of any election that changes could be made. So, yeah.
So when we vote on this at the DA, on this, what we're voting is that the chapter election process will be moved to the procedure manual.
Yes,
And
correct.
that procedure, and that's all we're voting on, nothing about the procedure, so, right? Is that
Right, that's correct. Yep,
And so we're assuming that the procedure will be formalized way before the next election, and that the membership will be notified.
oh, absolutely. Yep,
Is,
Yep.
is that what you're saying? Okay.
yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Mike Romano, UD, Mike.
Yeah,
I have to speak again about carts and horses. This is, I love you guys on the board. I have great esteem for all of you, and I love the leadership we have at the moment. But that's what we have at the moment. In the interest of long-range democracy, we're taking something that's constitutionally protected, so to speak, and making it kind of arbitrary for the board, whatever the board is. You know, I'm sure the people in Wisconsin thought their negotiation rights were pretty set in stone because it was state law. But, you know, things can change. It just seems hazardous. It seems dangerous.
And I like your point, sir.
I think first, remember, this can be amended so that if the sense is that the delegate assembly should establish the policy, that can be done in paragraph N of Article 8. Procedures for nomination and elections consistent with this article shall be determined by the delegate assembly and shall be published to the membership. So that can be done. And as long as the Constitution guarantees members the right to vote for chapter leaders, as it does, then I think that there is a preservation of democracy. This is, remember, a process and procedure set of paragraphs and sections that is contained within Appendix A, which is what is being pulled from the Constitution. So, that's my response, is that, if you want to put the policy power into the hands of the delegates, that's an amendment that would certainly be considered in order and could be debated. And I encourage you to consider that. And at the same time, I think one of the challenges that I have felt from the time I first was on the board years ago and continue to have is I'm at times not sure exactly why we have an executive board unless they actually have some responsibilities to do stuff. And this, and that's why we would like to see the board be held responsible for making decisions, so that also when it comes time for delegates to vote for exec board members, they are voting on policy decisions, procedure decisions, and substantive things that I think would lend itself to elections that would be contested and elections that would be, I think, meaningful. So yeah, that would be my answer. And I again, Mike, your concerns are valid. I think raising them from the floor, and as you so choose, proposing an amendment, that would be great. We want to have a full and open debate and discussion of all of these matters. I will move to item 10M.
To place, all participants are now in listen-only mode.
And this is to clean up language that we saw as problematic going into the Janus case. And actually, at the AFT convention, Jerry noticed the language that the AFT leadership brought to us, the delegates in Pittsburgh, and we had a conversation and said, yeah, I think this is the language that perhaps we ought to consider for our Constitution. It is almost identical to what we approved as AFT delegates at our national convention back in last summer. Or whenever it was, I don't even remember now. Yeah, it was last summer. Yeah. And as you see, UUP shall remain affiliated with New York State United Teachers and its affiliated bodies. However, the president of UUP may adjust the terms of, change, or terminate such affiliations with 2/3 approval of delegate assembly members present and voting. What this does, first and foremost, this does not. Okay, this is not, and there have been questions raised. This is not a disaffiliation vote. Okay, please understand that. I can't even number for you the number of times when I have met with the various presidents of NYSET, 3 of them in my 6 years, to discuss the financial support they provide for us, our dues structure, staffing issues, policy issues. And I have always felt that nowhere in our Constitution, getting back to Mike's point, nowhere in our Constitution am I empowered to do this. And so when we, for instance, talk about the dues structure that UUP has with respect to NYSET and AFT, there is going to have to be a discussion with those 2 affiliates. And what this article does is give the president of UUP, whoever it may be, I or my successors, whoever they might be, to sit down with NICET and AFT and talk about these important issues. And if questions are raised at a delegate assembly, should whoever that president be come back and say, we've negotiated with NICET, this is what our dues are going to be, no one can go to a microphone and say, well, why did you negotiate that? You weren't authorized to do so. This constitutional amendment does that. It also, gets into the issue of affiliations. We, in the past, had an affiliation with AAUP. I would argue that my reading, and I might be wrong, but when we affiliated with AAUP, that was a vote of the delegates. And as I recall, it was a majority vote. One could argue that should have been a membership vote. The disaffiliation with AAUP by a vote of one, meaning it was by a margin of one vote, should have been done by the membership. The cost of a membership vote is incredibly expensive. And not only that, in a nightmare scenario where if, NICET or AFT collapses for whatever reason and there is a need to disaffiliate, to go to the membership and argue against staying with our union would be absolutely a gift to our enemies. There is no expectation whatsoever that that would ever take place. At the same time, I believe we must formalize in our Constitution that any affiliation, and we're back in conversations with AAUP, that should we affiliate with them. And also, I have got a reach out from an organization of general practitioners in the medical field. I don't remember the name of the organization, but they would like an affiliation or some sort of relationship. I don't feel comfortable coming to an agreement without bringing it to the delegates. This amendment does that. It is in many respects a formalization of what UUP presidents have done in the past, but it puts it in our Constitution so that the responsibility as much as the power is made clear. So again, we pretty much plagiarized AFT's constitutional amendment on this. We took it, we would like to put it in place to, in essence, clean up the procedure so that, again, whoever the president of UUP is may undertake discussions, negotiations, and then come back, report to the delegates, and the delegates act on it. It's cleaner, it's neater, and I believe better for UUP. So I'll open up the phones for any questions that you might have on this.
Hi, Charles again.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you mentioned AAUP, which is an interest of mine as well.
Yep.
How does the wording allow you to negotiate a relationship with AAUP, which then goes back to the delegate assembly?
No, it doesn't address it one way or the other. But it does, it has been common practice that any kind of affiliation, as we were with AAUP, would come to the delegates. But I can tell you, having been on the executive board at that time, there was a lot of confusion as to how we were supposed to proceed. And again, this formalizes it in terms of having the delegate assembly make that determination.
Okay, so you're not saying it should say United University Professionals shall remain affiliated with New York State United Teachers and other academic bodies, or you don't want to add something?
No, because that hasn't taken that, and that's why we refer to it as just affiliated bodies to capture those that come in. For instance, we're affiliated with AFT, and then because of NICET's negotiations with NEA, we are now affiliated with NEA. That was because of a NICET arrangement. And with these affiliations, those that we undertake directly, it's kind of it's catch-all wording, Charles, and it still falls to the DA. Other questions? Okay, hearing none. I want to thank you all for taking part in the webinar. Again, if your question was not, you didn't have a chance to ask it, or you have any additional questions, send an email to Jerry O'Brien Losi or to me. That'd be fine, and we will respond as quickly as possible. Or call us. Call the office. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you at any time between now and the Delegate Assembly. And if we don't see you or speak with you before then, we will see you in that first weekend of February in Albany. So thanks again for being on the call, for all the questions and the conversation and discussion. And hopefully we've helped clarify some things. And we'll move forward and take this business up at the DA. Thanks very much, everybody. And have a great weekend. And stay safe out there, because we're going to get walloped with a big snowstorm.